Way back in the ancient, if not quite primeval days of the gaming industry, a British video game developer called Bullfrog Studios would be founded in 1987 by Les Edgar and the now somewhat infamous Peter Molyneux. The latter's final project before leaving Bullfrog and going on to create the Fable series would be the strategy game Dungeon Keeper, released in 1997. In what was probably quite a novel idea at the time, you play as the bad guy, rather than the hero, overrunning a peaceful land, eliminating any heroes or other keepers who might stand in your way. Just before I go further into the game though, I'll just mention a couple of setup things. I played with the KeeperFX mod installed, which fixes bugs, allows for upscaled resolution, and makes some minor gameplay tweaks. Though I'm unsure how up to date the wiki is on it, as the win condition for the final level is supposedly different in KeeperFX than it is to the original game, and this was not the case when I played it. You do also need to do a small amount of messing around to get the soundtrack working, and can, if the 6 tracks available are not to your liking, swap them out for something else. So instead of
Sleepy Borough, a settlement in the fertile farmland near the mountains. Nothing ever happens here, apart from some good deeds and the odd exchange of kind-hearted greetings. A disgusting pit of Hades, in other words.
You can instead choose something much more fitting.
Woodley Rhyme. A village of such obscene contentment it's criminal that a horde of undead vigilantes haven't massacred every soul in the place.
I actually recommend leaving this alone though, because each level is set to only play one track on a loop, and so it ends up being a highly effective way of ruining music that you like. Dungeon Keeper is probably best described in modern terms as an intriguing genre mashup of real-time strategy and city builder, which is not a combo I've played before. The objective of each level is usually to carve out space to build rooms with the aim of attracting vile creatures to your hopefully efficiently designed dungeon, which you will then use to crush any enemies you face. You typically begin by taking control of a portal, through which your creatures will arrive, and then start mining gold. You will then use this gold to build a treasury to store it all, a lair for creatures to make their cozy homes in, and a hatchery, which somehow infinitely supplies baby chickens to feed said creatures, despite the fact that the age of the average chick birthed in these hatcheries is about 2 minutes.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
From here, it can vary depending on what rooms you have access to in that particular level, but these are usually followed up by a training room to increase the level of your creatures, and a library to research more rooms and spells. There are a decent number of rooms and spells that will become available to you as you make your way through the game, and I am compelled to remind any of my fellow Zoomers who might play this game, read the manual. I'm sorry to all those older gamers out there who are shaking their heads that this even needs to be said, but I'm afraid I only caught the back end of the era where manuals made for essential reading. They were pretty much already little more than flavor text by the time I arrived on the scene. Dungeon Keeper will teach you the basics by playing, but it won't give you the finer details. I forgot to read the manual until partway through, and there were some things in there that probably would have been good to know. Like how to stop your creatures being scavenged by the enemy. Hey, look, Vamps, we can talk about this, okay? You're tired of baby chicken on the menu? That's fine. I can add in some
Your gold
eggs.
reserves are running low. One of your minions has been scavenged.
Fuck! Or the fact that only humanoid prisoners will turn into skeletons. Though, now I think about it, getting frustrated that tentacles, which don't have any bones, aren't turning into skeletons maybe wasn't one of my more intelligent moments. And that, basically, is the game. You will train your army up, defeat your enemies, beat the level. As I said before, it's different from other strategy games, at least that I've played, and that makes for a relatively unique experience. But I didn't really like it. My number one reason is that it's slow. For what the game is, it is very time-consuming. Like, time-consuming is the word I would use to describe Dungeon Keeper. After I'd finished the game, I thought that this was only a factor in the later levels, but when reviewing my notes, I found that I started complaining about the time it was taking from quite early on in the game. So actually, it was always present and just kept getting worse. The thing is, you are never more powerful at the beginning of a level than your enemies, and so there is no incentive to rush out and go to battle early because you won't win. It is always better to stay tucked behind your walls and level your creatures up before fighting. The wiki describes level 18, which took me just under 2 hours to beat, as grueling, which isn't generally a word I love to hear used to describe video games, but maybe that's just me. The game endeavours to mix things up to some extent, such as your dungeon beginning in open space surrounded by lava instead of needing to be mined out of the rock, or not being able to build rooms at all and having to take control of them instead. But while these do a little to change things up, the core strategy of taking your time and staying safe behind your walls always remains in place. In some levels you do want to expand early. You still don't want to fight early, but you do want to expand early so that you can wall off important areas, but this is ultimately still that same strategy. What's more, this adds another level of frustration because if you try the same expand early strategy on another level, you might run directly into a group of high-level enemy creatures who will tear through you and force you to start again. Dungeon Keeper does have that quirk of older games where you are punished for not knowing what's coming next, which makes saving constantly a necessity if you don't want to have to restart the level you could well have been playing for a decent chunk of time. The most egregious example of this comes in the final level, where after killing the big boss, a huge army of his followers suddenly teleport into your base and smash the place up. It's an army that you absolutely will have no chance of defeating if you aren't expecting it, but it's also an army you'll barely have to touch if you reload a save and set up a metric ton of traps all over your base. As much as I enjoy some of them, I suck at RTS games, so I was initially attracted to the idea of not being able to directly control your creatures because I thought it would mean less micromanagement. This didn't really turn out to be the case. For one, it was not always easy to get them to do what you wanted. You could drop an imp next to some dirt you need mined, and it would run off to go and collect gold. And creatures that lag behind in a fight will simply head for home instead of pushing on with the rest of your army. I should mention that there is a spell that allows you to group your creatures and follow a marker, but this can drain your gold fast if you don't have a lot stockpiled. For 2, imps and scouting creatures like flies and hounds have a frustrating habit of running into enemy creatures and attracting their attention when you least want it. Particularly in the case of imps, who will retreat back to base and lead the enemy right to your doorstep. There is no way to stop this through micromanagement. You could sacrifice all these creatures, but that's not advisable, especially for the imps, which are pretty essential. The only way is to build a door and lock it so that they don't venture out. If you haven't been given doors for that particular level, or you haven't built any yet, or you are mining out a room and accidentally tunneled into open space, thus creating a hole in which you cannot build a door, you, my friend, are screwed. I'm conscious that it was possibly intentional that your creatures be to some extent working against you and difficult to control because that fits with the game's tone, but when you just want to beat the level, it was desk-slammingly frustrating. Some final nitpicks include having the same voice lines repeated at you over and over again. I particularly disliked hearing "your creatures are winning the battle" repeatedly while I watched as my creatures decidedly did not win the battle.
Your creatures are falling in battle. One of your creatures has joined the enemy. Your creatures have discovered a mysterious magic box. Your creatures are becoming angry.
I also found most of the spells to be more gimmicky than they were actually helpful, and found myself just tossing lightning strikes and heals into the battling mob and hoping it was making a difference. In conclusion, I can understand why Dungeon Keeper received acclaim at the time it was released, but unlike some other games from the 90s, I don't believe this one holds up very well. Despite being intrigued by its gameplay early on, I, on the whole, found Dungeon Keeper to be a frustrating, tedious, and above all, slow video game that I am glad I do not have to keep playing. There may be some of you who treasure this game, and thus simply believe I need to get good at it, but I'm afraid I already hold all of the high scores, so that's simply impossible.